Thank you for coming. It's nice to see so many people, some familiar faces and some not. And I think I'll just start by explaining myself, because I'm a bit of an outlier, I think, in this deconstructing conference, so in kind of bringing feminism to it. So I was invited to contribute a chapter to Alex and Michelle's theory, book on social theory in EAP. Partly because Alex knows that I'm interested in gender and language, and my doctoral thesis was, using feminist linguistics. And I think in preparing for writing that chapter, I had a look at what was out there in the literature in EAP, and looked at how feminism was influencing, EAP pedagogies or approaches to language. And I sort of noticed that there was a lot of kind of creativity in those articles that used a feminist approach. And that included kind of showing the thinking process behind writing, which I really liked because it's part of what we're trying to do with our students. And often it's an element that we don't discuss, how difficult writing is, how personal it is, how exposing it is. So I tried to weave that into my chapter, and I've tried to do the same with my presentation. So on the margins, you will see notes which you might think, what's that about? And it's just kind of thoughts that were going through my head as I composed the slides. So, feel free to read them or ignore them. Okay, so traditionally, I will start with a definition. I think everybody knows what feminism is, or thinks they know what feminism is, or has a particular view of feminism, which is why I thought I'd start with a definition and what it means for me within the context of EAP, and then hopefully have time to move on to how it can be applied to EAP as a social practice, as a field, and as a kind of approach to pedagogy as well. If I've got time, I'll end with a sort of mini example of what could be done in the classroom in terms of text analysis using a feminist critical discourse analysis. Okay, so defining feminism, and I use defining because I see it as a process that's in constant evolution. Feminism is never fully defined. But Deborah Cameron, who's kind of a well-known feminist linguist, thinks about it in sort of breaks it down into three areas. So feminism as an idea, and this is a philosophical and ontological position. So this relates to the belief that women are people, which is the kind of basic premise. Feminism as a collective movement which seeks to end sexism, exploitation and discrimination, and that's its kind of political meaning. But also feminism as an intellectual framework. So it's also described as a mode of analysis, a way of asking questions and a way of searching for answers. And this is the kind of critical definition of feminism, and is more what I focus on today. So I think there's a long history of a relationship of feminism to education in particular, and language education. And you see it a lot in the US, so in composition studies, in rhetoric, in sociology, in education. These are all affiliate fields to EAP, but seems very missing in EAP. I don't see much reference to feminism. And I'll come back to these a bit later. So in education, we get various definitions of feminism. Obviously, it's an equality discourse, so concerned with social equality. It's also an analytical framework for unpacking the micro-political, so how power is exercised at local levels, and how oppression works and its experiences, and where resistances might be possible. So that's thinking about the local context. Could be schools, it could be wider than that. But as well as political and critical dimensions in higher education, it's also oriented towards praxis. So it's concerned with ethical forms of personal and professional practice. And the ethics are really important, I think, to feminism. Again, defining feminism, there are lots of different types of feminisms or feminist labels in circulation, but again, they have unifying factors. So a political movement which focuses on investigating gender, but not gender exclusively, and also a movement which is emancipatory, so it aims to redress inequality. Those seem to be the sort of the core themes across all different types of feminism. And these are probably collocations or labels that you've come across. Am I right? Yeah. Do you use them yourself? So you often hear, I identify as a feminist, but, you know, I still shave my legs, or I'm not a feminist, but, you know, of course I believe in equality. So there's a constant kind of tension between what it means to be a feminist and, you know, the sort of social representations of feminism, okay? And it appears to be very controversial, I think much more so than other equality discourses, which are sort of often espoused uncritically. That's my view. I might be wrong about that, but that seems to be the case. And I would argue that this apparent confusion serves the purpose of undermining feminism. That actually the focus, often if you see in the media, is on, you know, let them fight it out amongst themselves. They don't really know what they're doing. There are different forms, or you can be a good feminist or a bad feminist. And I would argue that that sort of confuses what feminism really means and how it might be applied in the academy. So, yeah, a proliferation of labels. There's a focus on feminist credentials. So how good a feminist are you? You know, what are you doing that gives you the right to call yourself a feminist? And I think this relates to kind of issues around identity politics. But there's also a sense that feminism is very culturally bound. So what it looks like in different contexts will be very different because the social environment will be very different. There are also ideas about post-feminism, that we're living in a kind of post-feminist world. It doesn't really apply anymore. But it's often either invoked or maligned or ignored, okay, or taken for granted. And then there's this idea of waves of feminism, right? Sounds a bit like COVID, but, you know, first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave, where are we on now? And I think that's problematic because the waves are always in coexistence with each other and in sort of in conversation with each other. Okay, so it's not that we get over one wave and then it's wave 3 and wave 4. But you do see this in kind of in the media. And then you have this kind of commodification also and co-optation of feminism. So, you know, you have pictures like this which are very attractive, you know, that sort of sell the new face of feminism. Or you've got, you know, Frida Kahlo bags being sold in Paper Chase, and, you know, it's all become very mainstream. Okay, so this is my position on it, that actually this proliferation of types of feminism are a testament to its versatility as a theoretical perspective. It's part of its disruptive potential, so in a way, it's been successful, right? So it can disrupt socially and in education. And in some ways, it's a kind of victim of its own success, okay? I think it's a theoretical lens which does have social justice and emancipation at its core. And it is linked to other equality discourses, but it's not synonymous with them. So again, it might be in conversation with areas like decolonizing or inclusion. And it's concerned with the collective and structural causes and effects of inequality. And for me, my interest is how are these enacted through language. I also see it as being linked to intersectionality. You're probably familiar with intersectionality, but it's the idea of how different identity or social roles, different identities might privilege you or disadvantage you. So, you know, different aspects of your background and your context will affect how much agency and power you have. I also like feminism because it questions the distinctions between the private and the public. And it involves, and this is its ethical perspective, a lot of practitioner reflexivity. So the role of the researcher or the practitioner, what are they bringing to the classroom or you know, the research that they're doing? Where do they stand? Where do they fit? And I think they make a big point of kind of raising this. And there's a long history of feminisms engaging with language, you know, and the language we use, not just in the everyday, but in the academy. You know, so it's always surprising to me that we don't see more feminist language in EAP, because we're also concerned with language and language ideologies. I'm just going to have a break there. So I put this picture up because in the last I'm working at Leeds at the moment, but in the last university I worked at in Sussex, we shared in the EAP section, we shared corridors with historians, art historians, philosophers, and I would walk down those corridors every day for 10 years, and there were posters like this on the walls of the art historians' offices, and I bet they're having really interesting conversations in those classes. Why don't we have the same kind of engagement or the same kind of imagery? But yeah, does feminism really sit well with EAP? It kind of seems like an odd pairing, or, you know, incompatible bedfellows, potentially. Okay, so how might it relate to EAP? Is feminism incompatible with EAP based on critiques of it? Okay, so there was a widely read article, I think, that Ken Hyland published sort of in defense of EAP. And critiques of EAP include the fact that it's complicit in the relentless expansion of English, which threatens indigenous academic registers. So there's the sort of colonizing element of EAP, which I think has been raised by a few people in the conference yesterday and today. Also the fact that it's often seen as a remedial or service activity on the periphery of university life. And also that it perhaps imposes an imprisoning conformity to disciplinary values and native norms on second language writers. So the fact that we're often bound to teach conformity rather than disruption. And I think this is an important point that Hyland makes, that the problematization of... well, I'll let you read it, actually. I won't read it out. So essentially, I think the point there is that EAP tends to focus on texts and practices, and in particular classroom practices, and often ignores the kind of students' lives, experiences, and not just the students, but the practitioners, the EAP practitioners themselves, and how these are embedded in social context and how this might affect their disciplines. And I think taking a feminist lens would address this. So what can feminism contribute to EAP? So if we think about language centres within institutional settings, what kind of power do language centres have, and what gives those centres that power, and how does gender play into those power relations? So we are a complex community of practitioners and students. So how might our practices, relations, our relative status, power and agency be affected by our gender or our students' gender or other identities, and also by gender relations in EAP communities? Again, this applies to the EAP classroom. You know, what do disciplines look like in the institution and in the workplace? And what linguistic traces can we find? What discursive traces can we find of these power relations? And in what ways are oppressions, inequalities, and resistances articulated? So when I was preparing to write the chapter in the social theory book, I went back and looked over, a bit like Ian, all the articles that mentioned feminism in one way, and I think I only found 25 in JEEP, over 50 volumes. But there was a special issue on gender and language, and I read all the papers in there, and even in that special issue, feminism wasn't mentioned at all, maybe only in one or two of them. But I did look at the studies, you know, where gender became a sort of point of discussion. And I found that they were quite different, yeah? So Rosalind Appleby's did an ethnographic study of male EAP practitioners in Japanese universities. And she was concluding that EAP was gendered labour, and this was from that article. So although the men's accounts tend to frame teaching English for academic purpose as a rational, disembodied, asexual occupation, gender and sexuality are deployed as identity gatekeeping tools that serve to police the borders of academic English as an elite, male-dominated professional category. So that's an interesting perspective on that particular context. But not one I sort of relate to, not one that I think is mirrored in my own context. So again, the idea that it will have different affordances in different contexts. And Jackie Tuck, in a way, picks up on a different thing. So she wrote an article where she says, "I'm nobody's mum in this university, the gendering of work around student writing in UK higher education." And again, she conducted an ethnographic study across several universities and finds that there are discourses of care that invoke a kind of stereotypically female caring role in the role of EAP practitioners. So you often hear people saying, you know, I'm not interested in research or scholarship, I care about my students, or what I do in the classroom shows that I'm looking after them, I'm meeting their needs. You know, and that's potentially a very gendered role, okay? And that this distinction between emotional labour and intellectual labour can also be very stigmatising and can account for why, you know, some EAP practice might be seen as marginal or service or peripheral. And she talks about language workers, Cinderella workers, you know, again, relating to these discourses. Okay, So EAP is social practice. What can feminism contribute to that? So my question would be, how are the findings of these studies in this special issue, how do they relate to your context or to other contexts? Could we replicate studies and see what kind of discourses are prevalent across, you know, your own institutions or contexts, and where does gender fit in? And is there a dialectic between the perspectives of practitioners, institutions, and students? How can we explore that? And what are the typical EAP practices and products, and who participates in them and why? If you're interested in kind of the questions that feminism or feminist approaches might take, do have a look at the chapter, because I kind of end with a list of questions. So, you know, you might want to take one of them and look at them for your own practice or context. Okay, so applying how would I apply this to a sort of classroom, I guess? Whenever you present, you know, there's always a follow-up with, yeah, what does it mean for my teaching? How can I take this into the classroom? So I was looking at this fairly recent book on writing supporting genres. So this is, it's quite a small book. I don't know if you've come across it before, by Swales and Feek. But it looks at things like writing emails to your tutors, or writing a statement of purpose, or a personal statement. So they're kind of genres that are really high stakes for students. They will need to engage with them, but we often don't teach them in the EAP classroom because we don't have time, or we don't focus on that. And what struck me really was how missing a sort of social perspective was in this book. So, you know, this is a typical task. You have a kind of example email, you know, maybe 2 example emails, and you look at, you know, you analyze it from a genre perspective, you identify the moves, and this is what you teach your students, okay? So here you have, you know, the move analysis for statements of purpose. I think statements of purpose are used in the US context. Here we would talk more about a personal statement when you're applying for a degree. And they look at examples and they identify these 5 moves, right? The first move is the hook, you know, a narrative to grab the reader's attention. The program, so why this is particular specialization location, so why you want to study this subject. The background, so evaluation of your own skills and landmarks of achievement. Self-promotion, so distinctive individual qualities. And then projection, what are you going to do? What's your career ambition? So that's what we teach our students. And there's no mention at all in this you know, textbook, I guess, of whether any of these moves might be inflected by, you know, students' identities. So how does self-promotion sit if, you know, you come from a particular context or you are a particular gender? Is that easy for you? And we've been finding this. I've been working on a project with Michelle Evans on writing promotion applications. And we asked people to send us their promotion applications, and then we interviewed some lecturers from different disciplines, and most of them were here at Warwick, actually. And it was interesting that self-promotion came up as a big kind of bone of contention for promotion applications. So some lecturers reporting, I don't find it easy to talk about my work using the I pronoun because I don't see my work as only my work. I see it as collaborative. So, you know, and there's a very strong gender element to that, you know, this sort of, but, you know, academic promotions do demand that you present what you've done as an individual. So, you know, issues around ethics and appropriation of work and how you collaborate, you know, feed into these genres. Okay, so could you argue that some moods might be gendered, you know, like self-promotion? And at the very least, what do some textual analyses or rhetorical moves in text owe to or occlude in terms of power relations, okay? But also the processes of text production, who's producing the text, who are consuming the text, how are we thinking about that? But again, you know, that's not to say that that is the only way to look at genres, okay? There's a lot of genre innovation as well, and a lot of disruption and evolution of genre theory approaches, but they are sort of prevalent in our field, I guess. Everyone's familiar with them. Okay. So I took a kind of, just to give an example of what you could do in a classroom, I took a feminist critical discourse analysis approach, where you look very closely at the text and the language of the text, and then consider the discursive context of the text, and then the wider kind of social and historical context. And here's a quick example. So these are two extracts, again, from the Swales and Feet text. I'll just give you a few minutes to read those. And I think they're authentic extracts from students' personal statements. So I've deliberately removed any reference to the student's gender or their name. What would you guess about the two students? Student 1. Male. Studying what? Medicine, sports science. Okay, and student 2? Female, studying what? Okay, so studying, I think it was actually an applied linguistics student. So, yeah, so you see there that the examples are really stereotypical. So, you know, the male student, but that stereotyping happens through the language. So how is the language indexing the gender and, you know, and even the discipline, okay? So in the first extract, if you look at the nominal phrases and the lexical sets, you've got football and you've got, you know, sports injury. In the second, it's much vaguer. It's more around sort of academic conferences, I guess. In the first one also, if you look at the verbs, they're, you know, they're about action, and the student is sort of displaying their technical knowledge, right? Whereas in the second one, the student tends to be focusing on her own confidence, right? And there's a lot of language around, you know, the emotion or sort of, yeah, emotive language, really. So in a sense, by doing these analyses, you can show that. You can show how, you know, particular genres might be gendered, but you're also reproducing the gendering, if you see what I mean. So we might want to think about that when we do teach genre. And just to mention, what I noticed in the articles and the writing I looked at around, you know, feminist scholarly and pedagogic practices was that there was a really clear focus on creative and critical collaborations, okay, between practitioners, writers, researchers, and often a real creative questioning of form, okay, by also acting it out. So, you know, if you look at the Hanforth and Taylor articles or Lillis, McMullen and Tuck, you can see that they're trying to innovate, yeah, in the genre. But there's also a questioning and problematizing of key concepts of academic discourse that we use in EAP. So what thank you. I'll just wrap up really quickly. So what do we mean by argumentation and voice? How do we bring those in? And how do we make those ethically part of what we do? And a focus on kind of principled feminist pedagogy. So again, thinking about our roles from an ethical perspective. Okay. Yeah, what have I left out? I've left out so much, but I just wanted to end. I'm part of a WhatsApp group where, you know, with old friends where, and they're all women. So I wanted to ask whether in their fields, you know, they find that their work is gendered, or there's sort of, you know, there's a kind of difference between men and women, I suppose. And one of my colleagues from the legal profession, so she's a QC, and she responded, yes, how long have you got? Legal decisions are gendered, not least because senior judiciary is still 70% male, and that's partly because senior judges are required to stay in judges' lodgings, which is ideal for 60-year-old men who leave their wives at home. So, you know, in a way, in higher education, we're preparing students for entry into the workplace, but actually, you know, there are still issues in the workplace, despite, you know, progress and despite apparent changes to equality. Another one, an art historian. So I asked, do you think your work is gendered? And she says, yeah, the gender bias in the art world is very clearly laid out in the Freelands Foundation report, which she sent me a link to. And then she said, oh, and your favourite newspaper wouldn't publish artworks depicting bush, or let me use the word pussy in a feature on art and women's sexual pleasure. And I responded, haha, except when quoting Trump, I presume. And she said, yep, it's okay to use the word when it's referring to abuse, but not for affirmation. And then she said, oh, and about gendered language, my pet hate is the word seminal. So, you know, it's still, it's still part of our lives, you know, inequality. So just to conclude, I would argue that feminism isn't just for women, it's for everybody, and certainly applicable to our academic context. And that feminist concerns with language and discourses make it a really good lens for EAP. The educational concern with inequalities and social justice make it a generative framework, so we can use it to think about potential inequalities and social justice. And really a question is, are we resistant as academics to examining the conditions of our own production, as some people have claimed? So is that the case? Are we squeamish about looking at the ways in which we work? I would argue that there's scope for a lot more inquiry in EAP. You could also look at EAP in the disciplines, and really remind ourselves of the social underpinnings of some of the theories that we do use, like SFL, you know, they are social theories of language, and we've kind of often forgotten the social part of that. So, yeah, so I hope I've piqued your interest and not scared you away. Thank you.